Welcome to the deep dive.
Hey there.
Today, we are really plunging into, well, the complex and honestly utterly fascinating world of Christian music.
It really is a unique space, isn't it? You've got faith, art, culture, commerce, all kind of bumping up against each other. Definitely more than just background noise.
Absolutely. And we've pulled together quite a stack of sources for this deep dive. They cover pretty much everything.
Right. From the really old historical roots, hymns and psalms.
All the way up to the modern multi-million-dollar industry today.
Yeah.
And of course, the controversies, the debates about style, substance, all that stuff.
So our mission here really is to kind of navigate through all of that material, help you pull out the key insights, maybe uncover some surprising facts, some connections you hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, connect the dots a bit. Ready?
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this. So, starting at the beginning, where do our sources say Christian song truly began?
They take us way back, right back to the absolute roots, singing psalms. That was really the foundation. Worship music straight out of Scripture.
Just using the Bible text itself as the lyrics, basically.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so fast forwarding quite a bit then, our sources point to this period often called the Golden Age of Hymns. That's mostly the 18th century, right?
That's the one, yeah.
What made that era so, well, golden? So significant?
It was just this time when hymn writing exploded. It really blossomed and became absolutely central to how congregations worship together.
So moving beyond just singing from the Bible.
Exactly. It became about writing new songs inspired by it. Often, with maybe richer theological ideas, more personal expression coming through.
Some really key figures pop up here. Isaac Watts, for instance. What was his big contribution?
Well, Watts looked at congregational singing at the time and frankly, thought it needed fixing.
Oh, really? How so?
He felt it was often performed pretty poorly and maybe too stuck on old covenant themes, not enough Christ focus for the new covenant church. So his big innovation was writing these new hymns, but, and this is clever, using the familiar meters from the Psalms.
Ah, so people already knew the tunes.
Right, or at least the rhythm, the structure.
Yeah.
So they could sing his new, more Christ-centered words to tunes or rhythms they recognized, made it much easier for churches to actually adopt them.
That's smart, very practical.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Wesley brothers, Charles and John.
Yeah, hugely influential. Charles especially became just incredibly prolific after his conversion experience. Wrote thousands of hymns, apparently.
Thousands, wow.
And John, he was influenced by the Moravians, had his famous strangely warmed heart moment. Together, they pretty much created Methodist hymnody.
Okay.
They even used Watts's hymns in their early meetings, building on what he started. Their stuff really emphasized personal experience, grace, powerful stuff.
But it wasn't only the sort of famous preacher types, was it? Our sources mentioned Anne Steele, Theodosia. Her story is quite moving.
It really is. A Baptist hymn writer faced incredible personal tragedy, disabled from a childhood accident, I think, and then her fiancé died just hours before their wedding.
Oh, terrible.
Yeah, but she wrote these hymns expressing just deep faith through that suffering. And she wrote under a pen name, gave the money to charity. It really shows how hymn writing was also this channel for personal grief and devotion, not just leading public worship.
Right, and you had others too, like Bishop Ken writing hymns for students pushing for devout singing. The sources also make a point to include work songs and spirituals. There's an example of a corn song.
And that's crucial. It reminds us Christian music wasn't just happening in formal European-style church services. It was woven into daily life, into the resilience and resistance of enslaved people. And then Richard Allen publishing the first African-American hymnal in 1801.
Drawing on Watts and the Wesleys.
Yeah, it shows this amazing cross-pollination, this adaptation happening, powerful stuff.
So, okay, the 18th century really was this century of divine songs. Laid a really rich foundation, theologically, structurally. But music never stands still, does it?
Never.
So jumping way forward now, the 20th century, the 60s especially, we start seeing something new emerge, contemporary Christian music or CCM. What was driving that shift?
The sources really point strongly to the generation gap of that era.
Okay.
Popular music was just changing so dramatically, rock and roll folk. And for young people then, music wasn't just entertainment, it was like their main language.
How they expressed identity, values.
Exactly. And the challenge for churches was, well, many traditional churches struggled with it.
Right, so
They often, maybe without meaning to, asked young people to kind of leave their musical language at the door. leave the rock and folk outside.
Right.
And the sources suggest this sometimes ended up confusing, personal taste in music with God's actual will or with deep spiritual principles, created a real disconnect for some young people.
That makes total sense. Music is so tied up in who you are. So how did churches start trying to bridge that gap?
This is where Jesus music comes onto the scene. It was much more of a grassroots thing initially.
Right.
You started seeing mainstream churches experimenting. Catholic churches had guitar masses after Vatican II. You had songs like We Are One in the Spirit becoming popular everywhere. Youth camps bringing in new choruses alongside the old folk songs.
And artists like Larry Norman were really out there, kind of pioneering this sound in the wider culture.
Absolutely. They were making music that spoke the language of that youth counterculture, but the lyrics were explicitly Christian. But it wasn't smooth sailing. They faced serious pushback.
From traditional churches.
Yeah, and even from the established sort of gospel music industry that already existed.
Right. The sources detail some pretty tough challenges for those early Jesus music folks.
Oh, definitely. Lots of resistance. You hear stories about churches making bands play in the basement if they had drums.
Seriously? In the basement?
Yeah. Or venues saying they'd keep the concert money for the ministry, but the artists never saw it. Widespread bootlegging of live tapes was a huge issue, too.
Right.
And there was this feeling among some artists and their families that they were facing unusual, spiritual attack because of the ministry they were doing through music.
That sounds incredibly difficult. A tough road. And the traditional Christian publishers, were they jumping on board?
Not right away. They were hesitant. Companies like Wordmer, Zondervan Milk, and Honey, they eventually dipped a toe in, but they were pretty wary of the louder sounds, the longer hair associated with rock and folk.
Still that culture clash.
Big time.
Yeah.
The sources mention artists like Randy Matthews or the band Scylla having contracts terminated because they were seen as getting too loud or looking too secular. Randy Matthews apparently even got unplugged mid-song at a festival for using electric guitars.
Unplugged. Man. So what finally started to shift the industry's view? What made them take this new music more seriously?
Well, crossover success helped a lot. VJ Thomas, who was already a big mainstream artist, had a conversion experience and then released this album Home Where I Belong in 1976.
A faith-based record.
Exactly. And it sold incredibly well. The sources really point to that as a key moment. It showed the big companies, hey, there's actually a significant market here. There's money to be made.
Ah, the market potential. And that opened the door for people dedicated to building this specific industry.
For sure. People like Chris Christian, he signed and produced Amy Grant's very first album, which was huge. And Brown Bannister, who produced her later stuff that was even bigger, he's described as maybe the most influential Christian musician you've never heard of.
Yeah.
Hugely important figures in shaping the sound, the professionalism of early CCM.
So the Jesus music movement kind of paved the way, showed the demand, and then the industry started to formalize and grow.
That's it. And grow it did. Our sources show revenues jumping massively, from $180 million in 1981 up to $680 million by 1991.
That's huge growth in a decade.
Became a proper industry. And today you've got these major players like Capital Christian Music Group, CCMG. They're part of Universal Music Group, one of the biggest labels in the world.
Right, and the sources mentioned their leaders, Brad O'Donnell and Hudson Platchey, have been in this field for decades. Combined 4 decades.
Yeah, a long tenure. And their approach is described as music first, focusing on building long-term relationships with artists, using data effectively, being entrepreneurial, but within that big universal system.
And it seems to work. They mentioned massive streaming numbers for artists like Hillsong, 7.1 billion streams in North America alone.
Million. And Chris Tomlin, 4.6 billion global streams. These are enormous numbers. Shows the reach.
They also have a big publishing arm, UMPG, that's Universal Music Publishing Group. They represent songwriters like Jonas Marin, Ellie Holcomb, and Tommy Prophet, who has, get this, 33 RIA certifications.
33. That's incredible. RIA certifications, gold, platinum, they signify massive sales and streaming success. So, yeah, 33 is phenomenal.
And being part of that bigger Capital Universal system helps them too, right? Like supporting artists who want to do faith-based records or use Christian radio data, even if their overall career might aim broader.
Exactly. Gives them flexibility, leverage.
Which kind of leads us into this whole crossover artists thing. Artists who start in CCM but then find mainstream success.
Yeah, like Sixpence None the Richer back in the day with Kiss Me, huge hit. Or bands like Mute Math. They actually sued their label to get out of the Christian market designation, even though they sold a lot of records there.
Interesting. But the sources say this crossover path isn't always welcomed.
No, it often draws criticism from within the Christian community.
Why is that?
There seems to be this underlying assumption sometimes that there's only one right way for a Christian artist to act or market themselves. The sources mention this kind of motto: don't cross over unless you plan to take the crossover.
Implying you need to be explicitly evangelistic in the mainstream, not just making art.
Pretty much, yeah. It's a complex pressure.
The sources bring in an academic idea here, the theory of religious economy. How does that fit in?
It's a fascinating lens. It basically views American society, religiously speaking, as a kind of free marketplace.
Okay.
Religions and religious expressions are competing for adherence, driven by supply and demand. In this view, CCM is seen as a form of religious pluralism, and the artists are like supply-side firms creating and offering religious products or content.
So the competition and disagreements we see, even within the Christian music world, could be seen partly as market forces.
That's the idea. It helps frame some of the tensions, including the financial ones. Think about Keith Green's really radical stance back in the day.
Right, not charging for albums.
Yeah, based on his conviction that if the gospel was free, you cannot charge money for an album. He tried giving music away. His views, and then his tragic death in a plane crash, really impacted how people thought about money in the industry.
And artists still face financial struggles today. The sources mention that.
Definitely. They talk about artists seeing friends leave CCM for genres like country music, partly because it just pays better, or they feel the labels and management treat them more like, well, professionals.
That must be a real tension. When your career, your livelihood, is tied up with your deepest faith and passion.
Huge tension. Where does ministry end and business begin? How do you navigate that?
And part of that business side, maybe less visible to us as listeners, is music licensing, right? CCLI.
Absolutely vital. CCLI stands for Christian Copyright Licensing International.
What do they do?
They provide the licenses that allow churches to legally copy song lyrics, project them, arrange music, stream services with music, all that stuff.
Okay.
The fees churches pay for these licenses are supposed to go back to support the songwriters and the publishers who own the copyrights. It's the underlying structure that allows creators to actually get paid and keep making music.
Gotcha. Okay, so we have this history, hymns, contemporary styles emerging, this whole industry structure.
Yeah.
Which brings us, I think, to where things get really spicy.
The great debate.
The ongoing debate within churches. Hymns versus contemporary worship songs, or CWS.
Yep. This is a big one in the sources. Lots of strong feelings on both sides.
Let's break it down. Starting with the arguments for hymns, what do the people who prefer traditional hymns emphasize?
They often point to the structure first. That regular meter, the predictable rhythm, makes them easier for a whole congregation to sing together, unified.
Okay, singability.
And theological depth, big time. The argument is that the hymns that have survived for centuries have done so because they're theologically rich in sound. The weaker ones just faded away. They see hymns as designed for the people singing to God.
And how do they view contemporary worship songs, or CWS, from that perspective? What are the critiques?
The main concerns are that CWS can be theologically shallow, maybe too repetitive, focused more on generating an emotional feeling than conveying deep doctrinal truth. Some of the critiques in the sources are pretty sharp, actually. Calling CWS dreck put forth by the so-called worship industry. Seeing it as, cheesy, overly produced, maybe designed more for performance, for selling albums, than for genuine congregational worship.
Wow, dreck. Strong words.
Yeah. There's also a preference among some for songs based on whole chunks of scripture, like Psalms, rather than just pulling, say, one line or phrase out of the Bible for a chorus.
Okay, so that's the pro-hymn side. Now, flipping it, what are the arguments for contemporary styles? For CWS, what do their proponents highlight?
They often emphasize the relational aspect, the feeling that CWS allows people to sing to Jesus personally.
More intimate.
Exactly. That sense of intimacy really resonates, especially, the sources suggest, with younger adults. It feels more like a personal conversation with God.
And that ties back to the music as language idea, right? If contemporary styles are the language younger generations speak.
That's a core argument. Using music they actually listen to, that they understand culturally, can make worship feel more authentic, more like home for them, less like something alienating.
Makes sense, and they push back on the theological critique.
They do. arguing that, hey, lots of contemporary songs are theologically rich, you can't just paint the entire genre with one brush, and they bring up history again.
How so?
Pointing out that things we see as traditional now, organs in church, even some older hymns, were once new, controversial innovations themselves.
So today's contemporary is tomorrow's traditional.
Kind of, yeah. That perspective. And also the idea that the music style itself is basically neutral. It's just a vehicle. What really matters is worshiping in spirit and truth, not whether you're using a pipe organ or an electric guitar.
One source even mentions churches using mainstream secular songs, like from U2 or Coldplay.
Yeah, pushing that idea further. The belief there is that any music that is good already belongs to God, so you can use it in worship context. Shows you the real breadth of thinking on this.
Okay, so this whole landscape, the rise of contemporary music, the industry, these debates, it hasn't been without conflict, has it? The sources talk about controversies and criticisms.
Oh, yeah. Plenty of those. Right from the start, there was internal opposition, especially to rock music.
From church leaders?
People like Jimmy Swaggart, certain publications, warning against rock, seeing the image, the sound, as contradicting Christian faith, maybe stimulating sensuality, violating principles of biblical separation from the world.
And even industry events, like awards shows.
Yep. Debates about things like the Dove Awards, critics arguing that giving out awards is ungodly, that all rewards should be heavenly, that kind of thing.
And there's that practical challenge for artists, that Christian music ghetto idea.
Right. The music being maybe too religious for secular audiences, but too aggressive or worldly for some church audiences. Finding that middle ground is tough. Sources mention artists feeling pressure to distance themselves from the Christian scene if they want mainstream credibility. Stay far, far away, as one put it.
And then there are criticisms directed at specific, very large, very influential worship ministries.
Yes, the sources get into that quite a bit. Hillsong, for example.
What are the main criticisms mentioned there?
They fall into a couple of camps. One is leadership scandals, the founder Brian Houston covering up his father's child abuse, his own later infidelity issues, the scandals around Carl Lentz in New York.
Right, those were widely reported.
And then there are theological concerns. Perceptions that some of their teaching or emphasis is self-serving, maybe lacks reverence, or leans into what's called the prosperity gospel, that health and wealth message.
Okay. And elevation worship is another one mentioned.
Yeah, similar kinds of critiques surface there. Concerns about the lead pastor Stephen Furtick not being ordained by a major denomination, allegations of him putting down other churches, and some really serious alleged statements attributed to him, like claiming, "I am God Almighty," which, according to one source, he didn't retract. Or telling listeners they're prophets or the same as biblical figures. These things get linked sometimes to concerns about the New Apostolic Reformation. Or NAR, this movement aiming for societal influence, claiming modern-day apostles and prophets have special authority.
And beyond the leaders in theology, the music itself from these big ministries also gets specific critiques.
Common themes pop up, yeah. Often described as lyrically, maybe, a bit fluffy or vague, repetitive, overly focused on emotion, sometimes using language that critics feel borders on romantic, lacking reverence for God. And sometimes a sense that the songs seem quickly written, maybe formulaic for mass appeal.
Okay, so those are some heavy criticisms. But the sources also provide counter-arguments or add nuance, right? It's not presented as totally black and white.
Definitely not. An important point raised is that song lyrics aren't systematic theology. You can't always expect a 3-minute worship song to lay out complex doctrine perfectly. Lyrics might be expressing personal testimony, like that Hillsong Transfiguration example describing a feeling, a spiritual experience. It's not necessarily meant as a precise theological statement for everyone.
Makes sense. What else?
There's the point about copyright and royalties. Because of how structures like CCLI or UMPG work, buying or streaming the music doesn't necessarily mean your money is directly funding the specific church or ministry leaders, especially if the publishing entity is somewhat separate.
That's a practical distinction for listeners who might have concerns.
It is. Some sources also suggest, maybe a bit cynically, that some criticism directed at these huge ministries might stem partly from jealousy, noting that other successful Christian artists, like, say, the Gettys or Mercy Me, also make significant money but maybe face less public scrutiny.
Interesting point.
And there's the perspective that some critics might just be being overly picky, maybe lacking discernment themselves, or being too quick to judge lyrics that are meant to be personal expressions of faith, not airtight doctrinal treatises. And finally, the idea that even within a church that might have controversial leadership or some questionable teaching, the specific people writing the worship songs might actually have solid theological training themselves. So the music they produce could be more grounded than other aspects of that ministry.
It's complicated. CCM has navigated all this, sometimes consciously offering wholesome alternatives to mainstream music.
Though sometimes, critics argue, maybe stripping styles like rap or reggae from their cultural roots in the process. And yeah, the scene has sometimes felt a bit isolated, hermetically sealed in its own world.
Okay, wow. We have covered a ton of ground here. History, industry, the big debates, the controversy. So let's try and pull this together. What does all this mean for you, the person listening right now?
Well, hopefully understanding this whole journey, the history, the business side, the arguments, gives you a much richer framework for thinking about the Christian music you encounter.
Right. It's not just, do I like this song?
Exactly. It's about recognizing all the complex forces at play. Faith, sure, but also commerce, cultural trends, theological debates. They all shape the music you hear.
And it really highlights that constant tension for artists and ministries, doesn't it? Trying to be creative, reach people, stay true theologically, and navigate the realities of a commercial market.
It's a tough balancing act, and Christian artists, who some supporters see as almost amateur theologians, offering unique insights on faith and culture, they're right in the thick of it, using their gifts in this really complex environment.
So we've traced this path from ancient psalms,
Yeah.
the golden age of hymns,
Through the Jesus music revolution,
to today's global streaming multi-million-dollar industry.
we've looked at the history, the business, the artistic shifts, and those passionate debates that just keep going. It's a world shaped profoundly by both deep faith and, let's be honest, powerful market forces, always changing, always sparking discussion.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you to maybe take away and chew on. Considering this whole history, we've talked about conflict, adaptation, from banning drums to arguing over lyrics. How do you think music might continue to push the boundaries of Christian expression and community in the future? And maybe more importantly, what role do you, as a listener engaging with this music, actually play in shaping what comes next?